Welcome everybody to this Q&A live session from the course GLOBE in Coursera. I'm Emma Alvarez, social media manager here at IESE, and I would like to explain you just a few technical issues. As you can see on your screens, there are two boxes. One is the Q&A, and you can use for send your questions during the whole session, and another is the chat. Please use the chat box for technical issues so our team can help you. You can expand the image of your screens by pressing the group icon, as you can see on the screen, and then the chat and Q&A will appear as a pop-up on the top of the screen. Well, we have today a group of Salle Universitat Ramon Llull students, led by the Professor Aragon. Good afternoon, everybody. And I would like to introduce you the Professor Pankaj Ghemawat, that is a Professor of Strategic Management here at IESE. Good afternoon, Pankaj.
Good afternoon. So, welcome to this session. First of all, our live visitors from University La Salle, and to explain to our audience that is viewing us, these people have literally been viewing the lectures on Coursera that we've been using for the GLOBE course, but then they've been blending that with some discussions in the classroom, etc. And so this just happens to be another one of those attempts at blending, although in this case it's me who's involved with them rather than their regular professor, because we were really interested in trying to understand what some of the possibilities are about combining online education with in-person education. So our plan for today is very simple. I haven't prepared any slides because all of you get to see enough of my slides in the course of sort of going through these Coursera lectures. But the idea is very much to just sort of try and use this format, this relatively small, intimate format, to actually have a discussion around some issues. And so what we'll do, let's see, we'll start with questions from people here in the room, but as Emma mentioned, those of you who are watching from afar are, of course, encouraged to write in with any particular questions or areas that you'd like to see discussed, and to the extent that time permits, we will try and accommodate that. So with that relatively extended introduction, time to get started, and so just curious, we'll get the ball rolling. Ismail?
Yeah. So do you think that's what we call globalization in reality is westernization, especially concerning the cultural aspects? So what are your thoughts about it?
Okay. So one of the things, I started teaching about 30 years ago at Harvard, and the first thing I learned is that when running a discussion, never directly answer a question, respond with another question. So my question back to you, Ismail, is, okay, what evidence are you thinking of, or are there particular sectors that are much in your mind as you think that globalization is primarily about westernization, particularly on the cultural dimension?
I think about the music, movies, and all these kinds of things. All the things which are cultural. We can say that the United States export their culture all over the world, and it's the same for Europe. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. So other perspectives on that, because I don't know how many of you share this concern, because if true, this is probably something to be concerned about. Certainly the pre-course survey we ran for our Coursera students, a majority of the people agreed with the idea that globalization leads to cultural homogenization. So Ismail's concern isn't unique. Of course, cultural homogenization is a little bit broader than westernization, because it might be convergence to something else other than currently Western cultures. But a similar parallel concern certainly seems to be widespread amongst the students taking this course via Coursera. And so I'm curious about other perspectives on this issue that Ismail's raised. And again, as a discussion method leader, I sort of first wait for hands to go up. And then when they don't go up, I turn telepathic, figure out who is about to raise their hands, and call on them. So anybody have a perspective in agreement with or in disagreement with Ismail on his question about culture?
Well, my name is Tom. I think you might be right, because Western countries are mostly more developed than, for example, African countries. That's why they also introduced more their culture all over the world. And I think maybe it's something for the future that Africa will also, and Asia, China, for example, will introduce more of their culture to America or Europe. But for now, I think it's mostly the Western world who is globalizing the rest of the world.
Claudia, you had your... Yeah.
Yes, I agree on his point of view. And we've also talked in class about cultural dimensions, the hospitality dimensions. And I also think that in management, for example, is it true that all the theories that are being applied are more westernized and not global at all? But however, I also think that little by little we're having influence from other cultures. So maybe right now it's more westernized because we just started from this point of view, but in the future it may move around and change.
Okay, so clearly Ismail hit on a latent concern that at least a number of you have in terms of what does all this mean for cultural diversity and cultural variety, etc. And are all these advances coming at some incredible cost? So the first thing I'll say is it really is a very complicated question. And in fact, this is what I've been trying to work on for my next book. So I have spent some time trying to think about all the complexities that the issue presents, because part of the problem is that it's very hard to measure culture or measure many aspects of culture. And so it's a little bit hard to sort of be as clear-cut about the evidence as, for instance, when we're talking about economic interactions across borders, where we can measure trade flows, we can measure investment flows, etc. Having said that, I think that Tom's Tom's response to me suggested at least a partial way forward, which is that we have to be careful to distinguish westernization from the general process of economic development, because the two interact, of course, in obvious ways, and that was Tom's point. The Western countries are more advanced than much of the rest of the world, so that's clearly affecting where culture flows from and the direction that it actually goes in. But to give an illustration of the difference that this can make, think about our eating habits around the world. Basically, there's a lot of cross-country work that's been done that suggests that after $5,000 or so of per capita income, roughly, there's a huge demand for convenience. And so you see a shift to processed, packaged foods with all the health consequences and everything else that comes with that. Now, the question is, should we be blaming globalization for that? Or should we be blaming the apparent pattern whereby as people have higher income levels, the opportunity cost of their time goes up and they're willing to spend less and less of it actually cooking? So I think one of the complications in addressing Ismail's very interesting question has to do with the fact that there are multiple things that are going on at the same time. And so it's a little bit hard to exactly isolate what globalization is responsible for. But that said, and I think I put a few of these data points in my video on cultural distance for Coursera. So I talked a little bit about how cultural products tend to be exported much less than products and services in general. Of course, that's just one very tangible indicator of cross-border flows. So we can talk about information flows and the notion that telephone calls, people following each other on Twitter, etc., still seem to be very, very highly localized, although it leaves open the question of how much cross-border interchange is actually sufficient to trigger fundamental change in a culture. And similarly, people movements seem a little bit limited, whether we're talking about students or migrants or even tourists, particularly when we reckon that a lot of tourists actually are increasingly in these all-inclusive vacations, where they actually have relatively minimal exposure to anything having to do with the local economy, with the local country in, say, a place like the Dominican Republic, etc. So I think that there's certainly some room to be concerned, but I think the specific industries that we think of often in this context, which were the ones that Ismail cited, let's talk about those for another minute or two. So on music, 20 years ago, Bill Brody, who used to run MTV International, used to say, "Obladi, oblada," sounds the same in any language. Since then, MTV has moved significantly to localize their content. And so people, in particular Joel Waldfogel, has done some studies suggesting that the local content of the top 20 list has steadily increased over time. Hollywood might seem to be a big exception to this because it still does have roughly a 45% share of worldwide box office revenues. But I just got an analysis from one of my ESE students actually yesterday about the Turkish film industry, which struck me as typical of what's happening in large markets. There has been a huge surge in the production of feature films in Turkey, especially since 2003, 2004. And at least according to the report I got yesterday, 9 out of the top 10 movies in Turkey last year were local movies. So I think that probably the 60s, 70s, 80s, I would sort of share the notion that the flows of culture were primarily in a particular direction, especially with the shift that I see going on in the world's economy towards emerging markets, and with the notion that their level of integration with the rest of the world is still much lower than advanced countries. I think I'd expect to see more influences in the other direction, as I think Claudia was suggesting. Ismail's got a follow-on question.
I know that the flows of...
Sorry, Ismail. I have a request from the chat. So if you students can be a bit more loud, to speak more loud for the others. Sorry and thank you.
Okay, sorry. So I know that the flows are not really high, like you said, and you proved it. But don't you think that they are the most influent things? Because when people see movies, they see the lifestyle of American people. So don't you think that the cultural products are the most important because they export a way of thinking and a way to lifestyle for European teenagers, I would say.
So let's focus in on movies, because I think culture is such a diffuse topic that unless we sort of get focused on something, it's a little bit hard to get anywhere. So clearly there are lots of US movies watched in the rest of the world, and that may have some patterning effects. One sort of crucial thing to remember is, first of all, the movies that really sell well around the world, and there are a few exceptions, but the ones that really get internationalized are the sort of action adventure, big, let's blow up lots of things at one time. And there are some clear economies of scale for those 12 Hummers to be blown up just once in Hollywood, as opposed to at a local level in every country market around the world. So I would argue, first of all, that the foreign film viewership statistics overstate cultural impact, because if you look at what actually travels across borders, it's not the sensitive family type movies or the dramas, etc. It's sort of fairly minimalistic action adventure movies that I think, whatever their other virtues, probably emotional depth is not one of the ones that I would associate with the Transformers doing really well around the world. Second, I think that film critics who sort of looked at this also sort of think that while people might watch the same movie, the meanings they attach to things are very, very different and are heavily conditioned by their culture. So it's not a tabula rasa, a movie gets beamed out and all of a sudden, and I know you didn't think that, Ismail, but just to sort of dramatize the point, there are some pre-existing ways of looking at things. And so Avatar, to take an example of a movie that did really well around the world, Avatar had particularly complicated resonances in China in terms of despoilation of the environment, etc. And the Chinese government ended up limiting its run, even though the movie houses were still full, because they thought it was assuming a whole kind of significance in China that they didn't really want overemphasized. So I think the second point would be that people construct their own meanings on top of some of the interchange that does occur. And then the last thing I would say, but again, I'm not going to sort of say that this is conclusive. The last thing I would sort of say is that, in addition to people constructing their own meanings, in addition to the flows actually being limited, we have to remember that culture itself is very dynamic and has always been a dynamic construct. So it's a huge surprise to people who buy Navajo rugs in the US to realize that many of the colors we now associate with this traditional form of culture were actually introduced in the 1870s, before which those rugs actually didn't have bright colors. So I think it's also, I think while the question is certainly one that I wouldn't claim to have answered, I think it is a complicated question to answer, and we have to ask ourselves, what is the right baseline in terms of an appropriate level of cultural change as well? Or should cultures stay absolutely static? So we've spent a fair amount of time on culture, so maybe we should move on and sort of, let me see who might want to go next in terms of raising themes for discussion.
I have another question.
Tom?
I have a question about the European Union and related to my country, the Netherlands. I think the next topic in the new elections in the Netherlands will be about a further integration into the European Union. And I'm feeling that in my country, majority of the people is afraid or against more integration and more power to the European Union. So my question is, what do you think will be the effects of more power to Europe for my country, the Netherlands?
Yeah, so particularly interesting question, because one of the governments I'm currently involved in advising is the Dutch government on relations with the EU. So I was up in The Hague 2 weeks ago meeting with people from the Prime Minister's office. So what Tom sort of is highlighting for us, huge concern, because the recent Eurobarometer survey suggested that 55% of the Dutch don't trust the European Union. So that's not a promising place to start in terms of what might happen. And Geert Wilders, and this was one of the things that at least has been reported very extensively outside the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, who is this sort of anti-Europeanist, anti-immigrationist, etc., just commissioned a report from an economic consulting firm that claims that the Netherlands will be much better outside the European Union than within it. The Netherlands, which I prepare an annual globalization index. It's a very integrated country, and at least from my perspective, without having any particular axe to grind, they've done about as well out of globalization as any country, any other country I can think of. But specifically, your question was more about the EU, and that's really a little bit what's at stake in the current run-up to the European parliamentary elections in May, which is, okay, at a time when David Cameron has promised the British, if the Conservatives get re-elected, a referendum on whether to stay in the EU or not. There are people within the Netherlands who are starting to think about, should we do, and the example of the Swiss recent vote to cap immigrants moving in from the EU has inspired a fair amount of thinking about, is it time for the Netherlands to edge away from Europe? So I think the first thing I'd sort of say is that the standard argument that's used about excess Dutch dependence on Europe, just because I was recently looking at the data, is a little bit bogus, because what happens is people say 74% or something like that of Dutch exports go to the European Union, and this is too much. What they ignore is the fact that, you know, one of the reasons why the number is so high for the Netherlands is that Rotterdam is the mouth of Europe in some sense. So there's an awful lot of trade that comes into Rotterdam that are shipments meant for Germany, places inland, etc., where actually the Dutch value addition is quite limited. This is just stuff passing through. So when you remove the transit trade, the Dutch are actually significantly less dependent on the European Union for trade than are many of the other countries in Europe. They've done very well, to my mind, out of their association with the European Union. But it goes back to, I think, Ismail's introductory question. I think that we're now at such a point of cultural mistrust, etc., that you can talk about all the rational arguments for allowing at least some immigration on a controlled basis, but people aren't buying. And so one of the things that the European Union will have to do, if it is going to make progress in the direction that you're suggesting, and I'm far from convinced that it will be able to, is actually persuade Europeans to trust the European Union more. Because a situation where a majority of people in Europe don't trust the European Union, I don't think bodes very, very well for the future.
I have another question as well.
Yeah.
Because how do you see the future of Europe? Will there ever be a federal European Union in which we can vote for our parliament? Because nobody chose Mr. Barroso, or what do you think? Will there ever be a European government or not?
What do you think? And I'm curious what the group here makes of all that. So start with Tom.
Well,
clearly you have a question in your mind, but if asked to answer, which direction would you lean in?
It's quite a challenge, but I think it's going there. But the inhabitants of Europe are not really ready for it, I think. But I'm wondering how they are going to manage it, the people who want a federal Europe, but we will see.
Okay, so this is for our audience online. This is a very European group, and especially because of that, I'm really curious what other perspectives on this issue are. Kari?
I think the people in the European Union, they're so nationalistic. I think they don't want to lose their country's values, and therefore I don't think that we'll have a European government. I think they will try to do business with each other, keep the European Union as it is, but I don't think they're going to have a whole government to go for Europe.
Other thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yeah, I agree with Carrie, because in Sweden it's very individualistic. So we love our country and we want to keep our government in Sweden, I think, and from my perspective. And so I think, as she said, we want the European Union for trade and traveling and makes everything easier, but we want to keep Sweden as Sweden.
And Sweden is actually one of the more integrated with Europe members of the Scandinavia, because when I was in Norway in September, I was struck by how clear they were, the majority of the population, that they didn't want any kind of, beyond the existing customs arrangements, etc., anything more to do with the EU. So this, to me, is this is the other reason why Ismail's question that started us out is so interesting, because I think personally that it's really these sort of cultural factors that are the biggest single constraint on moving in the direction that the world probably needs to go in. I'm a little bit hopeful when I look at human history, because at least some of the narratives that you read, human history is a narrative of gradually expanding circles of cooperation back from when we lived in tribes of 20 to 25 people to now we manage to live and feel some degree of fellow feeling for other people in countries with 10, sometimes even 100 million people plus, etc. But there's still this big drop-off that occurs at national borders. And so, for instance, getting back to the Netherlands, just because I was reviewing some of these data as well for the meeting up in the Hague 2 weeks ago, if you ask Dutch people how much they trust, or what percentage of, whether other Dutch people can be trusted, something like, I don't remember the numbers exactly, but 40–50% say yes. Most, other Dutch people are very trustworthy. And then it goes down. So by the time you ask them whether people from Southern Europe can be trusted, answers down more to the 20% range. By the time you get to whether Turks can be trusted, the answer is down to 5%. And so there is this sort of almost this, we talked a little bit about the law of distance in the context of the cage framework. It also seems to apply to trust, sympathy, and a lot of interpersonal interactions. And so trying to overcome some of that distance sensitivity, I think, is critical to whether Europe will be able to integrate further, because as long as Europeans continue to distrust even people from other countries within Europe so much, I find it hard to imagine things really being pushed together. Claude?
Yes. I would like you to ask a question, even if we get to more specific topics. In the first week of Coursera, we talked about the fears of globalization and how these fears about creates like winners and losers globalization and so. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think, like more in economic terms, if globalization is beneficiary for individuals or just for companies in a way?
Yeah. Again, I'm curious how widespread the concern is, because it's another one of the big concerns about globalization. So, other thoughts on that in this room? Yes, Matt.
Yeah, I think that it depends of the countries, because some countries take advantage of their resources, so they are the winners, we can say, of the globalization. But some other countries are exploited by other countries, so they cannot develop. And I think that they are those that we call the losers of the globalization. So I think that we have to control globalization, because when it's uncontrolled, it's like a wild globalization.
Okay, so left to itself, this is going to really wreck certain countries and certain peoples. Carrie?
I think that companies benefit a lot more than individuals, because the companies, well, especially the big multinationals, they benefit because it makes it easier for them to deal throughout the countries. As an individual, I think for some people, they're more or less receptive of globalization and don't want to change. So I think it's much better for the companies. They can earn more money this way also, instead of for the individuals.
Okay, so
But then,
Claudia, you're the one who started us on this. Yes.
But I just wanted to add something about it, because I think that if we think that way, because we were talking about that we are not so globalized, and by being conscious of that will help like promote more globalization in a way, or make us conscious that we need it. But I think that by enhancing like the benefits for individuals, globalization will go farther than just, because I say that, and because of that I asked that questions, that maybe we have in mind that it's just companies or governments or more like powered people in a way to say who benefit from globalization rather than individuals.
Yeah, so it ties in a little bit to the discussion we were having under the previous question, which is that some of, so there is certainly, as long as individuals, whether rightly or wrongly, believe that globalization is really mostly for the benefit of corporations as opposed to individuals, that is going to be a roadblock to further globalization. Personally, this is the sort of topic on which one's perspectives usually don't change much, even in the course of a 5 or 10 minute person-to-person discussion. I got very interested in this issue right after I'd finished my second last book, Redefining Global Strategy. And that was when there was this sort of huge spike in rice prices in 2007, 2008. President Sarkozy, then of France, amongst others, started talking about how this was clearly, the result of globalization and currency speculators and so forth. And, rice is a sensitive product. People depend on it for just basic subsistence above and beyond anything else. And so this got me thinking, okay, the rice market clearly isn't working very well if it's going through these huge fluctuations. What if all the sort of assumptions that we make about globalization being good are really contingent on a very limited, stylized model of markets working perfectly, in which case nothing bad can really happen? So I set out to write this book called World 3.0, which was my attempt to be specific about some of the benefits that I thought were undercounted about globalization. And that's chapter 4, if I remember correctly. But what made the book long, and frankly a bit harder to read than it should be, was I had 7 chapters in the middle dealing with most of the issues that people raise around globalization. It makes companies more concentrated, it creates environmental externalities and havoc, it amplifies risks, it leads to imbalances, it implies either economic or political exploitation, and it involves cultural homogenization. I would say that where I ended up was caution about 2 kinds of things: short-run financial flows as potentially being quite destabilizing, and second, imbalances, which over time, if they do mount, at some point are going to have to be unwound very, very rapidly. But beyond that, I think while there are some concerns, if I try and do the cost-benefit analysis as best as I can, I'm sort of convinced that there are huge benefits to individuals, ultimately, not just to companies, around globalization. And I think that not all individuals are equally well positioned to seize those benefits, but one of the reasons why it's interesting to take a course like, say, Globalization of Business Enterprise in Coursera is that there's a real dearth of people, even within companies, who are able to operate effectively across borders. So there's some professional reasons why it might be useful to learn more about globalization. And then there are, of course, the personal enrichment reasons about what the benefits are. But I think one's unlikely to do that if one starts off with the assumption that globalization is basically generally bad for individuals. I think one should probably, even if one thinks that, one should probably try and be specific about the ways in which it's bad, etc., before giving up on the idea of individuals profiting from globalization. Yeah.
I have a question from Ana Alvarez from WebEx. She asks if small and medium enterprises can have a bad impact about globalization, and how can they react to this effect? How can they take advantage of the globalization?
Okay. Large companies already know how to export and invest. For small companies, I've looked at them mostly in the context of the US, although I've done a little bit of work on European small and medium enterprises. So there are a couple of things that stand out. First of all, globalization means many different things. So a higher percentage of small companies in the US, their first encounter with globalization is actually in terms of importing inputs rather than exporting output. And that's very valuable. Some work that I've done with my colleague Bruno Gassiman here at IESE suggests that, you know, imports into Catalonia have been responsible for significant amounts of productivity growth, maybe even more than exports in terms of some of the things that they permit. So there are many ways to globalize. It may be on the input side, it may be on the output side, it may even just be at the level of getting ideas from overseas. And so even if your company is so small that it doesn't want to penetrate foreign markets, thinking about whether there's anything you can learn by visiting foreign trade shows or seeing how foreign competitors are doing might be useful to try out in your own country. Second, small and medium enterprises also have to recognize that globalization is a complicated process. If the world were flat, it would be simple. Go forth and, you know, do what you do at home and presumably it will work well. It doesn't quite work that way. So they need to sort of try and figure out who within the company is actually going to have the bandwidth to devote a significant amount of time and ideally have some clout within the company. In many family companies, which many small and medium enterprises are, that's often a family member, often a younger generation family member who's trying to figure out something new to do. Third, it does require some resource buffers because you usually don't win sustained export orders over a 6-month time frame. You have to keep at it and you have to be willing to commit to this kind of process for a few years. And finally, and let me stop for now, it was amazing, at least for the US sample, how many of the small and medium enterprises were actually unaware of US governmental programs that were available to help small and medium enterprises export. Governments are generally fairly interested, or at least talk about helping small and medium enterprises export. Might be worth checking out whether your local government has actually done anything that would be helpful in this regard, because in the US, a lot of firms simply haven't even bothered to look. So I think we have a little bit more time for another question or two. So is there anything else from the live audience, the online audience, Emma? Or
I'm trying to understand the question because it's two questions. One is how do you define an ideal globalized world, if that's possible? And the other one is will the current global democracy and the current advanced economies for that matter ever lead us to tend towards such a global world, and what rate you feel so?
Sorry, I didn't understand the second one at all.
Yeah, and I was trying to understand too. I think Tahit Soman refers to how can we live with this global democracy, and well, this can be linked with one question that was in mind since you were talking about that perhaps helps you to reply about the Ukraine environment that the Ukraine scene that we are today feeling and listen about. How can we apply this globalization framework to this situation, no, between Ukraine?
Okay, and this is and so we're running a bit short on time, and there are 3 questions. I don't know how clearly you see the links across them. I'm a little bit kind of lost. So let me just, since my brain can usually just process one thing at one time, let me just deal with the last question. So Ukraine, I guess as much as anything else, I mean, it is in the headlines, as much as anything else, it's a little bit of a reminder that some of the things we talk about in the course of the Globalization of Business Enterprise course, particularly this distance framework, can also be applied within countries rather than just across country boundaries. So if you look at what's happening right now between Ukraine and Russia, just as a descriptive matter, the Crimean Peninsula, which, as we're having this session, seems to be occupied by, if I understand correctly, Russian troops. That seems to be the part that they're trying to preserve a hold to. It's worth remembering all the ways in which the Crimea has a particularly close tie to Russia, and why, in some sense, that was kind of where you might have expected the fractures to occur. So culturally, of course, the eastern part of Ukraine is basically mostly Russian-speaking anyway, and Crimea in particular, given Stalin's ethnic cleansing of the Tatars back in the 1930s, etc., ended up being a very heavily Russian-speaking enclave. So it wasn't that way originally, but thanks to Stalin, ended up with Russian culture. It was actually, and I checked this because somebody told me this and I didn't believe him, it was actually administratively part of Russia rather than the Ukraine till the 1950s, when in some act of generosity and recognizing that it was a peninsula connected to the Ukraine, and figuring Ukraine would always be in the Soviet orbit, I guess Khrushchev decided to transfer it over to the Ukraine. Geographically, it's sort of, so close to Russia, so even though the land border is with the Ukraine, there was discussion this morning on the news about building a bridge, linking it to the Russian mainland as a way of bypassing the blockade they expect, probably, the rest of Ukraine to mount. And so, I think that quite apart from the Ukraine, where, the answer to this question that people asked for years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, will Ukraine move east or move west? Well, at least to some extent, it looks like it's being pulled apart by these internal differences. And we can make some sense of what's going on by thinking about distances within Ukraine, between the west and the east, to understand what's going on. So that would be a little attempt to make sense of Ukraine. The broader point I would sort of make around that is that particularly when we look at very large markets, and particularly when we look at the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, it usually is worth thinking to some extent about distances within the countries, because these are large countries. They typically have very poor infrastructure. They, in many instances, have a huge amount of cultural diversity within country boundaries, etc. And so while the GLOBE course is really focused on international interactions, I'd suggest that for mid-sized to large-sized countries, there's some additional mileage from taking the framework and trying to apply it to understand why Crimea or Eastern Ukraine in general might look so different from the Western Ukraine in terms of whether it's drawn east or drawn west. So I think that we're almost done with time. I guess time for one last question, and since we've had two now from the online audience, Sarah?
So a question about your passion about globalization. Where did it all start, and where do it originate from?
Well, probably an important part of this was, and we always joked that my parents got lost and we woke up one day not in India but in Indiana. So what happened was my parents moved because my father was doing his PhD from India to Indiana when I was 5. Then we moved back to India when I was 9. And that probably had a significant influence on me in terms of just my interest and curiosity about the world. Then sort of going to college again in the U.S., sort of, at Harvard College, even in the 1970s, was a very exciting, cosmopolitan place. So meeting all these people from all these different backgrounds and different parts of the world. That was highly energizing. But some of it was also this sense of, once I got to realize that I actually enjoyed being slightly out of my depth in an environment, of sort of deliberately going out of my way to create opportunities to do that. So still haven't quite decided if we'll use this video for the last week of Coursera or not. But in this video, I explained why, despite my significant apprehensions, I decided to take my first job after getting my PhD in London, because I felt that was an essential part of, getting comfortable with some legacies that ex-colonials still tend to feel, and so forth. So I think the broader point is, well, irrespective of whether your parents moved you from India to Indiana at age 5 or not, there are always things that can be done to get to know the world better, and the whole motivation to do so, at least part of it, involves the cognitive realization that most of us are actually pretty closed to foreign sources of influence. If we don't recognize that, then we probably won't feel any need to actually try and stretch farther. And as a result, all that distance sensitivity that I was deploring, whereby Dutch people don't trust foreigners nearly as much as they trust other Dutch people, and it's not just the Dutch, by the way, are things that will continue to be with us with all the constraints that that imposes. So with that, I think that we're roughly at the 45-minute mark. So let me thank you for coming to ESA for this discussion. It was very interesting to have this exchange without having gone through the material with you, but I was just sort of struck by how many sort of interesting ideas came together in the course of these brief 45 minutes. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pankaj and students of La Salle, German Aragon. And well, we'll see you here at ESE. Thank you very much.